Hey everyone, and welcome to a new series of videos. In these videos, we're going to talk about core data. It's going to be about 3 videos. I'm going to show you how to get your core data set up, how to create entities, how we add data to the database, how we can find information in the database, and how to list information in the database. And you can do an exercise on how to delete something from the database. So this app is going to be called My Shopping List. And then this is the screen, how it's going to look like. You'll have a table view. With that table view, you can have the list of items that you stored. You could add to it by clicking on the plus. You can search for something. Now, this is what we're going to start with to give you all the components or give you an overview of, about core data. And then you can refactor the project to get it to here. And you can click on one of them, and then it can show you the details of that core data. You can cancel, get out, and then it would be a nice exercise if you want to put a delete here, or if you can swipe on the table view, and then you can put a delete. All right, I'm not gonna do that in this video, but I'll show you how to do it, and I'll put the code for you in the class. What do we get? A database class that we're going to use in this course, in this video. All right, let's get started. So first, we need to create a project. So file, new project. And I'm going to call it next. It's a single view app. It's called My Shopping List. And this is important. You want to make sure that you use core data. If you do that, it'll include core data framework in your applications, and then it'll add all the necessary classes you're going to use for in this video. All right. So you click on next, create, create. Now I'm going to pause the video and then design the screens, and I'll come back. So we don't have to waste time on in the design part. All right, so let me pause this for a minute and I'll come back to you in just a second. All right, so what I did, just to show you, I created the storyboard. We have, and by the way, I will have a startup project so you can download from GitHub. So I will put that link for you on the on YouTube once I post the video, so that way you can download the startup project without having to recreate all of this. So let's just go over it quickly. We're going to start with this view controller. This view controller has an item description, and item type. When you click on an ad, it will add it to the database. To just get you familiar of the things that you can do with core data, I added also find item. So we will cover this add item and find item in the first part. And the cancel is just simply cancel that, dismiss this view controller. After we finish this part, we will create a table view controller. We refactor the project, and then we will use this as my starting point. From here, when you click on the plus, then we can show the screen. And then when you click on an item listed, then it'll show you the details of that item. All right. So that's what we're going to do in this project. So we have 3 view controllers. The first one is going to be my main one that we're going to work with. And once we get familiar with the code, we'll jump into the other part. So let's get started. First thing you need to do, you need to go to the core data model. So the core data model usually is the same name as your project. So my app is called My Shopping List. You'll see a project called My Shopping List, or a file, My Shopping List.xcd data model. So this one, you double click on it and allow you to design your tables or your entity. We're going to have one table, and it's called items. And how do we add an entity? You just simply click on an entity, and then you can rename this by double clicking on it. And I'm going to call this my items table. You hit enter. Once you create the entity, you can add attributes to it. So I'm going to create several attributes. I'm going to add ID, and then we're going to use a unique identifier. And we're not going to use it, but just I'm going to expose you to unique identifiers. So what the ID is, usually the field names are small letters, the ID is going to be UUID, which is a unique identifier. All right, and then I'm going to add another attribute, and this attribute is going to be item name, and then it's going to be a string, and then I'm going to add item type, and it's going to be a string, and I'm going to add item description, and it's going to be also a string. Oh, see, it doesn't like it when you make it a capital case letter, so now it's fine. And then you will put it's a string, and might as well we're going to add a date, or we're going to call that add date. All right, when it was added. All right, and this guy, you could specify a date, but I'm going to make it a string, and I'm going to format that string outside that class. All right, so either way, we can make it as a date if you want. That's debating. All right, I'm going to leave it as a string for now. All right. All right, so we're done. You're done with the entity. Now, with core data, with Xcode, usually it creates this item class for you. Now, I had mixed luck with this. Sometimes it creates it, sometimes it doesn't create it. So I'm going to use a safe bet, and I'm going to use whether it's created or not, your code will work. All right. So how are we going to do this? What we're going to do next is that we're going to create a class or a struct that represent this item. All right. So how are we going to do that? What we're going to do, we go to File, New, File, and I'm going to call this item. Sorry, it's a Swift class, and it's going to be called item.swift. In this class, the purpose of this is to mainly to define the attributes, and this class is it's like the model. This is the one that's going to be passed around in different functions and different view controllers. All right. So again, Xcode can create that for you, but just to be on the safe side, I'm creating it myself. All right. So what we need to import the UI kit, because we're using that UUID, and I'm going to say struct, and it is an item, and we're going to say ID, same fields that we have in the database, ID, and this var ID, and this is going to be equal to UIID, and then we're going to give it initialize it to a unique value, and so you don't have to pass it in the initializer. So another thing we're going to do is that item name, and this one is a string, item var, item description, and this is going to be a string, and then var item type, and it's going to be a string again, and finally the date var item date, or add date, and it's going to be a string as well. Again, you can add it as a date if you want. So that's first element, is that I'm creating the model. This model usually represent the elements that you have in the core data. I repeat, you don't have to do this, but because I have mixed luck with getting the Xcode to create these objects for me and to avoid headache, so I'm creating my own structure. All right. Okay, so that's the second step. We created the model, we created the entity in the core data, then we created the model. The next thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a class that this class act as, if you will, like a class that manages all my interaction with the database. And this is going to be the heart of core data. We're going to call this class my helper class or my database helper class. And then we will put all the functions that that interacts with the database. So it's all in one place. I don't have to put it in every view controller, in every screen, or whatever you want to call it, in every function. All right. So I'm going to create a new file. This file is going to be file new. And this is going to be a Swift file. And next. And this is going to be called my helper class. All right. So it's the file name, but here we're going to say first, I'll talk about this in a minute. So this is a class called my helper. All right, and it has a few functions in it. First of all, what I need to do, I need to import the core data framework in order to access the in order to access the core data. So what are we going to do? You need to say import. Again, might as well include UIKit just to be on the safe side. We might have to delete this and then import UIKit. Right, and then we're going to import core data. Okay, so that's necessary, right? Now, core data, the way you interact with core data, you need a reference to something called the managed object context. Now, I'm going to copy this and paste it, and I'll explain it to you. What is this managed object context? The managed object context is the class that handles all interaction with the database. Now, if you look, when you included the managed object, when you included core data in your project, in the app delegate, it added a bunch of codes for you. And these are your code that was added for you because it selected that core data. We don't mess with this, all right? We don't mess with this. It's all done for you. Some cases where you want to modify it, you go and modify it. But this managed object context is defined in here. And I just simply need a reference to it. How do I get a reference to it? If we go back to that my helper class we just created, I say let manage object context. This is the class that is key to our interaction with the database. I'm referencing the UI application, and if you don't have the UI kit, that will give you a problem. And I'm getting the shared instance of it, the delegate as the delegate. So this will give me access to the UI app delegate, persistent controller, view context. So this will give me the managed object context. So that's what I'm dealing with. I got my unmanaged object context, and I can use it in all of my app afterwards. So that is key. That's the first step you need to do. So I'm going to name these. So get access to the managed object context. That's one. Now I'm going to create several functions. So I'm going to create a function called add item. We'll come back to those in a minute. And then I'm going to create a function called find item. Again, I will come back to these in a minute. We're going to have a function called delete item. And then finally, a function called get all items. Obviously, you need update items, so I need to do that as well. And then we're going to have a function name called get all items. We'll visit each one separately, all right? But let's start with the first one, which is the add item. What is this function is going to do? I'm going to copy the comments here. I've done this, so we'll have a nice undocumented code. So we create a function that add an item to the items table. This function receive an item object. What is an item object? Now I want to take the value. Remember that structure that we've created called item? I'm going to pass this structure to this function in my helper class. So in my helper class, I will receive the item and its type item. Why? Now I have all the attributes that I need to set in the database. So I simply take the values, all the attributes of the structure, and then set the attributes in the table, and then save the information in the database. All right, so that's the first step. I'm receiving an item object that contains all the details that I need. Next is that you need to do a few things inside before you start writing to the database. The first thing that you need to do is that you need to get the entity description, basically the table description, right? So how do you do that? You say let entity equal what? Equal NS managed object, NS entity description, right? And now what do we pass to it? We need to pass to it the entity description. There is one for entity name. We need to give it the name. Pause something here for a minute. What we need to do is that we need to create again the entity description. So you say entity description for the entity. So I'm getting the entity, and then which entity you're looking for, which is the table name. Here is you have to make sure that you select the table name, whatever you named it in your database. And I believe we called it items. And what managed object context you're using. The managed object context that we're using is this guy here. So we'll say managed object context, okay? So that's the second step, all right? If you want to add. So first, we get the entity description. After that, we create the object. We create the database object. So get the description. After that, we say get, create the object, create the row that we want to insert, if you will, the record, object, record, whatever you want to call it, etc. All right. How do we do that? We say let item record row, you want to call it row, record, doesn't matter, equal to what? Equal to NS managed object. What is managed object? Managed object is basically the class that represents a row in a particular table. So when you're dealing here, you're not dealing with a relational database. You're dealing with object-oriented database. And each row that you receive from the database is actually a managed object. And now you need to pass to it the entity that you created. So there is something called entity, and then you insert it. So this one here. So you need to give it the entity that we're going to create, that we're creating this object for, and this is called entity. And the managed object context that we are inserting it into. So that is the managed object context. So you get the description, you get the entity, and this is an optional variable, so we need to unwrap it. You get the description, you created the object into the context. Now you set the value for in this item record, and then you simply save the managed object context at the end, all right? So how I'm going to do that? So the next thing you say, set, let me just delete those spaces. Set the values, columns, fields, whatever you want to call them, in attributes in the entity, right? With the values being passed to us. All right. How do we do that? So what do? We say item record dot set value for key. The values that we're getting from this item object that is being passed to us to this method. So I'm going to say item, no need, yeah, we need the ID. So I need to get the ID first, and then I'll give it the key. The key is the same thing that you have in the model, same values in the model. So if you go to the model here, you'll see the names of those fields. So I have ID, item description, item name, item type, blah, 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 all of that stuff. So now I'm going to go to the, go back to the my helper class. And then here I'm going to add the key. The first one is the ID, so I put ID. The second value, I'm going to copy this, command copy, command V, command V, command V, command V. Now, if the database, if Xcode created that item for me, I don't have to do this step. All right, and this is what I was telling you about. This is just to be on the safe side. In case you face problem, this will be guaranteed. This will work for sure, whether it created these entity managed object context classes for you or not. All right. So that's the first one is the ID, then the item name, and for the key is also called item name. And this is critical. You want to make sure you got the right names, and then description. And then here, item description. And then we have type, item type. And then here we got item type. The only one that is different is actually the create date. And then we have date, add date. And here we call it add underscore date. All right. Let's make sure of that. If we go back to the model, here's the model, and it is called under add underscore date. So that's fine. Okay, so now we set the attributes. The next part is to save the data. And to save the data, you could have a problem. So when we use the manage object context to save the data, it could throw an error. I'm going to show you what we do. So if we say managed object context, and then I type in save, this will save the state of all these managed objects. So when you create one, it's sitting in memory. When you say save it, it will save it to the database. Now, you'll notice that it says this throws an exception. So if I do this and I hit enter, it will give me an error here in a minute. It says, wait a minute, you need a try and catch. Now, if you click on this, hopefully it will give me, and then give me the option. You're on your luck. So what do I need to do? I need to enclose this in a try and catch. So this is going to be try, and then this is like a do. We're going to try this, and then we're going to catch an error, and then we're going to say let error equal error as an as error. And then if we do have an error, we need to do something with it. All right. So we're trying to save it. If we save it and say, okay, great. So we can say print and nothing happens, record saved successfully. If we do have a problem, what do we need to do? We need to say, let the user know that there's a problem. So say print. And it could happen for many reasons. You know, it could be you're out of space. You can save it, all right? Or something, maybe the database is locked, whatever, right? So say error saving the record. and then you can print out the error. So you say a string error to localize description. All right. So that is it. That's all we have to do to add a record to the database. The beauty about this, every time we're going to add a record to the database, all we have to do is call this function add item and pass to it the item object that we want to save to the database. All right. Now I'll run it, but before I run it, I want to do the find so we can show you. I can show you that when you save it, it will be saved. When you find it, you actually find it from the database. All right. So let's do the same thing. You can pause. If I were you, I will pause now. Make sure I do this. And after that, come back and we're gonna do the find item. Okay. I'm gonna copy the header of this guy. And we're going to add it here. And what does it do? Basically, this function that finds the item using, if I can spell using, right? The name of the item, the function return the item object. So what are we doing here? I'm going to receive the name, and if the name exists in the database, I would return the item object and with all the attributes in it. All right. So what I'm going to do, we need to say, we need to define a parameter, item name. And this is going to be a string. And then I'm going to return an item. Now I'm going to make that as an optional. Why do I make that optional? Because you might find it and you might not find it. If we don't find it, it becomes a nil. It stays a nil. But if you do find it, we create the object and pass it back. So in this function, I will define an item. It's called a var item, and it is of a type item, and it is optional. And we will change this variable based on whether we found it or not. But in either case, to avoid that error, to get rid of that error, I'm going to return that item. All right, so you don't have that error anymore. Okay. Okay, we haven't changed it, but we will change it in a minute. Okay. So what do we need to do? Now, this is the opposite. We don't need to insert into the database. We need to run a query. And based on this query, we need to find if we need to check the result. If the value is there, that means we found the item. If there's no values, I mean, there's no items there, we didn't find the item. So how are we going to do that? First, you need to create a search clause. Because we're searching for a particular name, it's like an SQL statement. So if you remember it from SQL, it's usually like this: select star from items, the table name, where item name equal some value, right? Let's say whatever the value is, right? T. So that's the SQL statement. Now, this part, this where clause, has a name in core data. This one, we call it a predicate. This part is your query. So we create two parts. We create, this is the query or the fetch request. This is my predicate. So I'm going to create the predicate first. We create the request, fetch request. After that, then we add this predicate to this to the search criteria or the fetch request. So how do we create the predicate or the search or the where clause, if you will? So to create the predicate, we say let search equal, and as predicate, and then you need to pass to it what you're looking for, which is there's something called format, this one here. So I need to put my criteria, which is my name from item name from the database, equal to what? Equal to a parameter that will be replaced by a value. This parameter will be what? This is going to be the name that is being passed, item name that is being passed to me. All right. So here, whatever we pass will be, that value will be replaced here. And this is the predicate we're looking for. So the item name is the field name from the model. If you look at the model again, here's the field name, item name. All right, this is what we're looking for. You can use any of those fields, of course, right? You can make an or and statement. You can make it more complex. And the value that we're looking for is the value that is being passed to us in this method. Now, we need to create the query. So, which is, this is similar to that select statement. How do we create the query? We create the query, we say let query equal, and as fetch request. All right. And then here we are going to receive back, we are receiving NS managed objects. When you search for something, you search for what? You search for, you could have one particular value or you could have multiple values. So the return of this request could be one or could be many. In either case, it's going to come back to you as an array of managed object. All right. So we need to pass to it the entity name that we are searching. This is a select star from items. This is that part. The entity names is going to be the same as in the table names, items. And that is going to be in a string, of course. So we are almost set. Now we add the predicate to the fetch request. So how do I say that? We say query dot predicate equal the predicate that search we created earlier. All right. Okay. Now we run the query. Again, you run the query, it will throw an exception. So you need to enclose this in a try and catch. Again, we can do the catch here since we already done that. Command copy. We put it here, Command V, and that will solve that problem. Now, what are we doing? We need to say let result equal what? Equal try managed object context dot fetch. What are we fetching? We're fetching a query, all right? So I'm going to fetch a query, which is the request that we've created, and that request is called query. All right, so I'm trying to get the data from the database using the search criteria, the predicate, and the fetch request. Now here we need to check, do we have actually items or not? Now, if we don't have items, that means what? We didn't find the record. And if we do have items, we found the record. So how do we know that we have records or not? All you need to do is that you just simply check if results.count is greater than 0. That means we found a record we're looking for. And if it's a unique record value, then you have only one value. But if it has multiple values, then you're getting the first element in the array, all right? We'll use this technique when we list all the items in a table view. Now here, you need to get let item, because we created an item, let row equal what? Equal results, and then the first element in the array. So that will give me the first element in the array. Whether we have many or one, we will get that element in the array. After that, we get the attributes. We do the reverse of setting these values like we did this. We do the opposite. We create the item and we set the item object here with the new item we found from the database. And then this is what is going to be returned to the calling function. So here we say let item ID equal what? Equal row. We do the opposite. Here say value, not set value, for key. What is the key? The same key that is found in the database, which is ID. Now you need to do additional step. What is it? You need to cast that variable to the type that is supposed to be, when the type that it was supposed to be when you define the database. Why? Because you're just getting raw values. It doesn't know what is that type. So you can make, because these are going to be optional because it might succeed or not. So with this casting process, it could fail. So this is going to be an optional variable. So same thing with the item name. So let's say let item name equal to, I'll just copy and paste this. And then this is going to be item name from the database. And then here we will do as a string because this is going to be as a string. We're going to get all these warnings. It's okay. Now we just copy and paste this guy. Again, command V, command V, command V. All right, and we're going to say this is item description, item type, and this is add date. And here we're going to say item description, item type, and here add date. All right, I'm not sure it was a capital or what, small. Okay, so add date. Promise you will get rid of all of these warnings. All right. So now I got all my data from the row that we read from the database. Again, if you don't have to do all of this, if you are able to get Xcode to create those managed object for you, classes for you. All right. And now what we're going to do, we need to say item equal item. And what are we passing to it? We're passing to it all those attributes. All right, so I'm going to pass to it item ID. And it is going to be unwrapped, item name. And it's going to be unwrapped. And item description. Unwrapped, and then item type. It's going to be unwrapped, and then finally, what do we call that? Add date. And it's going to be unwrapped again. Okay, That's all. This is all regarding the find. Now we're doing all this work, a lot of work, but that makes the other parts a lot easier. And I'm going to show you how to do that once we're done with this. All right, so that is how we create. This is the fetch, find an item, we're passing the string. We will, whether if we find the item, we return it. It's going to be an optional variable. We create a predicate, we create a request, we try to fetch that request. If the result has has rows in it, we get the first row, we get the values of that row, we create the item. If we have an error, we will catch that error and print it out. And at the end, we simply return that item. All right. I will put this code for you on the solution as well, so you can use it in your applications. All right. Okay, let's test it. And after that, if that works, we'll stop and then we'll start the second part. Okay. So hopefully I'm compiling it. If we run it, no errors. Now if I add T, I want Jasmine tea, and the type of it, it's drinks. And then maybe what I can do later on, I can show you. Now in the previous video, I showed you how to do a data picker or a picker view. So it'd be a good exercise to include the picker view in this view controller, right? But nothing happens. We haven't done a big part. What is that big part? The big part is that we want to take this information and from this view controller and call this helper class to add it to the database. All right, so let's do that quickly. If we go to the view controller, it's called item view controller. I got all my outlets ready. I have the button add functions here. What you need to do first, validate the data. I'll come back to this validate in a minute, validate the data. If everything is okay, next thing is that you create the object. And then call the helper class method, call the helper method to add the item. All right. First, we need to create a reference to that helper class. So say let helper, my helper, equal my helper class. And here's my class. And now, assume you validated the data. I need to create the object. Here's how we create the object. We're not going to do the date. Just this video is getting too long. And anyway, let's try it. So say let's say here, let name. We got those from the database anyway, right? So we can say item, let item from the screen equal item, and we pass to it what? We need to pass to it. We don't need to pass the ID because the ID has a default value. We just simply need to pass the date, which is txt date. I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to say let, so you can validate it. Let name equal txt name.text. Let ID, let description equal txt description.text. Let a type equal txt description, oh sorry, type that text. Now the date, What am I doing here? For the date, we need to use a system date. So say let current date equal date, and then this will give you the current date. Now, this one, because we're gonna save it as in the database as a string, you need to convert this date into a string, and then the way to do that, you need a date formatter. I'll do that quickly, and then we'll be almost done, I promise you. All right, so what we need to do to format the date, you need to create a data formatter. So you say, let data or date formatter equal to dot format equal date formatter. Now you can specify what format you want. So say date formatter dot format equal the format that you want. So the one you use, day, year, month, and then year. All right, and now you take the current date and use this formatter to format the date the way you want it. So you say here, let date equal data formatter to string from the current date. All right, so that will give you the current date and formatted in this format. All right. And finally, now you are ready to add those items. So this is going to be the name. This is going to be the item description. This is going to be the type. This is going to be the add date. And then finally, all you have to do is that my helper class dot add item, and then you pass the item that we just created. Let's test that part. Please see if that works. So if we're lucky, everything is going to work. So here is my screen. If I add T again, we add the item description. Jasmine T. And then the type again, you can say, you can do that as a data picker, add item. And you can see at the bottom here that record saved. But you would know if it was saved or not. The only way to know is that to retrieve it back to see if you can see it on the screen. So I added T. Let's add another coffee. Arabic or Turkish. All right, and that is a drink, and then add. So we have two records in the database. Okay, so let's stop this and do the find. The find is going to be easy. What are we going to do with the find? You just simply do the opposite. You say, my helper class let item equal my helper class dot find item. What are we passing? txt name dot text and unwrapped. And then we need to check if it's not null. If item is not null, that means we found it in the database. And what do? It's going to give me the item. So all the values are available for me. So I need to do, all I have to do is simply say txt type.text equal the item that I receive dot item type, and then txt dot description dot text equal item dot item what is the description, and then you can get the date as well and the ID if you will. All right. Now, if it is nil, we could do that. Else, if it is not nil, if it's not nil, we do that. But if it is nil, we need to inform the user the record was not found. Now, I included for you in the startup project a class called alert. This alert has two custom methods, and they are static methods. That means you can call them without having to create the object. One of them just to simply show a message, which is basically just an UI alert controller. Another one shows confirmation that if you want to delete an object or not. I'll show you how to use the first one, but you can use it anytime you want to confirm an action in your application. Okay, you can take a look at this example. It's a good example for you how to use alert controller and custom classes. All right, so if we go back to that item view controller, what do we do? From that alert class that I included, I'm going to say show a message. And this one, it has a title. The first thing is going to say warning. And then it's going to say record is not found. Okay, and then finally, this view controller that is calling that function is this controller. So that's the button find. We just simply call the method that we created in the helper class. If it's found, we put the information in the screen. Otherwise, we tell the user it's not found. Let's test that. And that's the last thing I promised you that we're going to do today. It's already almost 12 a.m. in the morning here, and I'm not going to do anymore. So if you do this here, if we know the add, we know we have tea and coffee. If I do tea and do find, it found it from the database. And if I do coffee and then I do that find item, it found it from the database. Now, if I add any, if I try to find something different, and if I say find item, you get that warning, record is not found. All right. That's it. This will give you a good start about core data and how to set up your database, how to set up the managed objects, how to set up the how to add to the database, how to fetch from the database. In the next video, I'm going to show you how we get the list in the database and how to, when you click on an item in the database, it shows you the detail of that item. I'll stop and I'll see you in the next video. I know this was long, but I think it's worth it.